Shabbat Shalom. Who is the hero of Purim? Who's the hero of Purim? The holiday of Purim, you know, it's next week. Esther. Why?
Because she risks everything.
Because she risks everything. Unlike all the other Jews that are also risking death.
But she walked into it straight, knowing that there was a possibility that she was doing, she knew she was doing something wrong. But for the sake of her people, she had to put herself on the line.
So she had everything, and she had a moment where she could make a difference if she was willing to risk her own life explicitly, unlike all the other Jews who were risking their life implicitly, meaning by Haman's decree. So perhaps she is the hero of that. After all, she has the book named after her. On the other hand, is she really the hero when she is sort of the paradigm of the weak, assimilated Jew? I mean, she is the one who just goes along with everyone else. She's the one who hides her identity. She is somebody who even has a false name rather than using her Hebrew Jewish name. Is this really the hero? I mean, not to take away from what she accomplished, but look at Mordechai as a contrast. And Mordechai told her to do it, so doesn't that make him the hero? He is the true leader of what's going on. Mordechai is the first person in the entire Tanakh that we have a record of being called a Jew, a Yehudi. He is the first person who has that title attached to him. And ironically enough, he's not a Judite. That's to say, he is not from the tribe of Judah, from which the word Yehudi comes. He is instead a Benjamite. So he is given two tribal affiliations because of the cultural term now being used to describe all of us, since it was the kingdom of Judea that was the most prominent during the destruction and that led to our diaspora. But his own family has the personal knowledge of their Benjamite origin. So he is doubly Jewish. And he is the one who stands up for us. He is the one who stands up against Haman. He is the one who refuses to bow down to Haman. Wait, why did he refuse to bow down again? Because you can't bow down to a person. Thank you for playing. It is the most common explanation that many of us learned as children, many of us have repeated to us as adults, and it actually does not conform to Jewish law. Jewish law says if you live in a monarchy and the monarch walks by, you bow to the monarch. You don't bow to their idols, you don't bow to their gods, but you can bow to a secular authority that has the rulership, has sovereignty over your domain. That's just normal. And indeed, even in the modern world, the classic example that continues to come up is if you are a member of the United Kingdom and you are granted an audience with the Queen, you bow. You bow, and there's nothing wrong with that. But Haman's not the king. It actually doesn't matter. As long as the authority has been granted by the laws of that state, such as they are in Persia, we follow the law. We follow the law, provided it doesn't lead us towards idolatry or other transgressions, which is how the rabbis save Mordechai's bacon. Because they say it wasn't Haman that he didn't want to bow down to, but Haman had his robes decorated with the images of pagan gods. So when Mordechai saw that, he knew that bowing to Haman would mean inadvertently and unavoidably bowing to the idols upon his garments. Therefore, Mordechai couldn't bow down. Now, whenever you see the rabbis working hard to come up with an explanation like this, you know they're not happy with the original understanding of the text. And indeed, the rabbis do not celebrate by itself Mordechai's behavior at that incident. Yes, later on, he is a champion and leader of our people. recognize what was, for Persia, a legitimate authority. Whether we like Persia or not, certainly better than Babylon, but not better than ourselves. Haman actually was an officer of the Persian court, and therefore, you should have bowed down to him. And they had to invent the idea of the idolatrous groves in order to try and polish the reputation of Mordechai and make him a little bit less of a bad guy. However, that is not to say that it was a unanimous opinion of all of our sages. In fact, there are some in the Talmud that say calling him both a Yehudi and a Benjamini, both a Yehudite and a Benjamite, was meant as an insult. You have to work with me on this one. We're going to do a little bit of history. So, what do we know about the Benjamites? Who is the most famous person that comes from the tribe of Benjamin? Besides Benjamin himself, yes. Saul, exactly. Whom we just read about. Right? And what is Saul's great claim to fame? He was the first king of Israel. And why was he the last of his line? Because of what we just read about. Because we read that when he went to attack the Amalekites, he botched the mission. He refused to actually complete the job. And who was it that was left there at the end? What was the name of the king that got him in so much trouble? Agag. How do we know Haman? What is Haman's ancestry called? He is the Agagite, the Agagi. He is a descendant of King Agag, of the Amalekites. So why is Haman alive? Because the Benjamites didn't finish the job. Why do we have Haman? Because Saul was too busy trying to take loot to actually complete the mission that he was sent on. Because the Benjamites botched it. And so a remnant of the Amalekites was able to escape, and that remnant eventually led to the birth of Haman, Agagite, the Agagite, the descendant of King Agag. And so when Haman had an opportunity, had the excuse, he was able to marry to the motivation of his ancestral house to try and wipe out the Jews. So he is a Benjamite in the sense that Mordechai is descended from the guy that put us in the position that we're in now in the first place. He is a descendant of Saul who messed up. But the Yehudi, where does that come from? How do we have a Yehudite? What was the Judah connection to Mordechai's ancestry? The explanation goes as follows, and you're going to have to work with me through a little bit of biblical history here. So you all know King David, right? Great guy, wonderful instrumentalist, not so many great kids. And during his reign, he had a lot of trouble with his sons. And one in particular, Absalom, staged a coup against him. And a coup that was nearly successful. And as David is running and heading out into the wilderness with his retainers, they pass by a city, and the city has a guy up on the walls who is hurling down insults at him, quite graphic and terrible insults, and chucking rocks at David. And as David goes along, it's like they're ducking rocks, ducking the words, and they eventually leave. And who was that guy? And what was his beef with David? He was known as Shimei. And he was from the family of King Saul. Now, why would the family of King Saul still have a gripe against David? Because David displaced King Saul. David took over from the line that should have gone, from their line, to the rest of Saul's household. So therefore, when they see David getting his comeuppance, when his own son commits a coup against him, they're like, ha ha, comes around, doesn't it? Hurts to be usurped by someone you trusted, doesn't it? Yeah, that's what it's like. They are basically trash-talking him from the walls. And David, what does David do in retaliation? Nothing. Nothing. In fact, when his retainers that are with David say, well, I'm going to go get here, David says, no, do nothing. I probably deserve it. And so Shimei lives, and guess who one of Mordechai's ancestors is? Shimei. So he is descended from the guy that David let go. And say the sages in the Talmud, Mordechai thus is the child of David, who allowed his ancestor to continue to live. And both sides, it was a mistake. Both the mistake of Saul to allow some of the Amalekites to escape, and both the mistake of David to allow Shimei to escape punishment. And because of that decision, we ended up with Mordechai. And Mordechai ended up almost getting us all killed because of his personal pride and arrogance. Told you had to work with me for the history game. Everything connects to everything. It's how Jewish history works. You've played Jewish geography, now you just have to add a time dimension, and you'll see the connections. But I'm not sure I understand. Saul is being attacked because he limited the destruction that he wreaked upon the Amalekites. David is being criticized as having been a co-parent of this guy Mordechai who got us all in trouble because he had a little bit of restraint when being insulted by this guy from the walls. I thought restraint and compassion and mercy, I thought those were all virtues. I thought those were all things that Judaism said, yay. But here our sages in the Talmud seem to be saying, yeah, no. There are times when you actually can be in trouble for having too much compassion, mercy, and restraint. There are times when what you are defending and what you are pursuing in your role demands that you finish the job. There are times when being king, whether you are David or whether you are Saul, means that you cannot only think about yourself, your personal pride, your personal feelings, but sometimes you have to actually carry out something that you might not want to do personally, whether it be the final destruction and breaking of the Amalekites, or whether it be attacking someone who is denigrating the kingship and casting doubts upon its legitimacy, which will eventually breed a subpopulation that is very antithetical to authority, who will eventually refuse to bow down to the official second in command of the Persian Empire and get us all in trouble in retaliation. There's a line that comes in the Haftarah that sounds very peculiar because it seems to be the opposite of how we imagine Saul. Samuel turns to him and says, "Do you think yourself small in your own eyes?" This is a line that was discussed among the Jews. And it's very confusing, isn't it? Because this is the guy who just built a monument to himself. And Samuel says, "Do you think you're small in your own eyes?" What he means is, do you think that what you do doesn't really matter compared to what other people do? Do you think what you do is of the same importance to the national destiny as what one of your soldiers does? Do you think that you're just one of the people? You're king. And that means what you do has greater impact. And that means you don't get to pick and choose the same way that a rank-and-file soldier gets to pick and choose. When you are king, you have to actually do what is necessary for the kingdom, even if it goes against your personal well-being or personal wishes. Saul did not understand this. And David, especially when dealing with the issues with his sons, did not understand this. And time again, it gets them into trouble. And we see that Mordechai as well, indeed, inherited this. Do you think you're so small, Mordechai, that whether you choose to bow down or not bow down to this authority in Persia will not affect more than just you? Do you think if he gets mad, the only thing that will happen is you'll get in trouble? You have to understand, if you are serving at the king's gates in Persia, you are an important official. And your identity as Yehudi, as a Jew, as a symbolic representation, at least if not more, that will come back to haunt the rest of us as well. So Mordechai you have to at least respect that he got us out of the issue as well. He was the one who was willing to say, oops, now we are going to have to fix this problem. And thankfully he knew exactly where to turn, which was to Esther. And just as a final note, yes, ultimately Esther is the true hero of the story. Not just because she didn't cause the problem like Mordechai, but because she is the character who shows development. And as any good student of literature knows, if you want to know who the hero is, look for the person who has the hero's arc, who has a beginning, a middle, and a triumphant end. Mordechai begins and goes through much the same. Ahasuerus the same, Haman the same. It is Esther that transforms, that becomes a Jew of strength, a Jew of conscience, and a Jew of action by the end, who is guiding the empire in a way that is good for her people, and in a way that does not unnecessarily provoke those powers. It is Esther that becomes the template of how we as Jews should live in the diaspora. And it is Esther that we celebrate most when we celebrate the holiday of Purim. Shabbat Shalom.